The nature of human connection is often like a tapestry, woven with threads of daily routine, shared meals, and the quiet comfort of a roof over one's head. Yet we rarely consider how fragile those threads become when the silence of the night begins to stretch into weeks. We find ourselves tonight in the heavy, humid air of Mobile County, Alabama, a place where the Spanish moss hangs like tired lace from the ancient oaks, and the pulse of the Gulf Coast breeze usually carries the scent of salt and pine. It is a landscape of vast, stretching fields and dense pockets of woodland, where the transition from a bustling neighborhood to the profound isolation of the southern backcountry can happen in the blink of an eye. In late January, the Alabama air carries a damp chill that clings to the skin, a season where the sun sets early and the shadows in the doorways of modest family homes seem to linger just a little longer than usual. It was within this setting that we meet Aurelia Choc Cac, a 40-year-old woman whose life was anchored by the rhythms of motherhood and the steady, often invisible labor of providing for her children. Aurelia was a woman defined by her devotion, a mother who kept the likenesses of her children close to her heart, quite literally, in the form of cherished jewelry. To look at Aurelia was to see the face of a protector, someone who moved through the world with a quiet purpose, navigating the complexities of a life built far from her ancestral roots. At her side was her 17-year-old daughter, Niurka Choc, a young woman standing on the threshold of adulthood, her life a canvas of unfolding potential that should have been measured in decades of sunrises. And then there was little Anthony Garcia Choc, just 2 years old, a child whose world was still small enough to be contained within the circle of his mother's arms, his days marked by the simple joys of discovery and the safety of a familiar voice. On the 31st of January, the normal cadence of life at their residence was abruptly replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural to those who lived nearby. A neighbor, noticing the absence of the usual domestic sounds, the lack of movement, the coldness of a house that should have been warm with activity, reached out to the authorities to report that the family had vanished. When investigators first crossed the threshold of the home, they were not met with the signs of a planned departure, but rather the haunting leftovers of a life interrupted. Inside, the air was stagnant, and the visual evidence suggested a struggle that had occurred in the very heart of their home. A mattress, a symbol of rest and security, was missing from its place, and in its absence, investigators were confronted with a significant amount of blood, the silent, indelible record of a tragedy that had already unfolded. The mystery of their disappearance began to cast a long, cold shadow over the absence of that mattress was perhaps the most jarring detail for the investigators who walked through the rooms of the residence on that January day. It represented a void where there should have been a place of rest, and the significant amount of blood left behind on the floorboards told a story of a struggle that the walls themselves seemed to be trying to hide. In those early hours of the investigation, the air in Mobile County felt heavy, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting for an answer that no one was yet prepared to hear. The search began not with a flurry of noise, but with a quiet, methodical look into the lives of those who were gone. Aurelia Choc Cac was known to be a woman of routine and dedication, a mother whose life revolved around the safety and upbringing of her children. To find her home in such a state of disarray was a direct contradiction to the life she had built. As the calendar turned from January into the biting chill of February, the silence only deepened. Neighbors who had once heard the playful sounds of 2-year-old Anthony or the quiet footsteps of 17-year-old Niurka now looked toward the house with a sense of lingering unease. The Mobile County Sheriff's Office, working in tandem with the FBI, began to piece together the movements of the family in the days leading up to their disappearance. They looked into the connections Aurelia had maintained, searching for any ripple in the water that might explain such a sudden and violent departure. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that the names of those close to the family began to surface in police reports. Among them was Silverio Garcia, a 60-year-old man who served as Aurelia's employer. Garcia's relationship with the family was complex. He had been involved with Aurelia's 21-year-old daughter and was living within the same social circle. While the investigation initially focused on the logistics of a missing persons case, the evidence of the struggle inside the home suggested a darker reality. The missing mattress, the blood, and the sudden vacuum of information pointed toward a tragedy that had already reached its conclusion. Even as the search for the physical presence of Aurelia and her children continued across the state lines and into the neighboring quiet of Baldwin County. Every lead was followed with a somber patience as the authorities moved through the damp Alabama winter, looking for the 3 souls who had been swallowed by the silence. The investigators moved their focus from the blood-stained floorboards of the Mobile County residence toward the tangled geography of Summerdale, located in neighboring Baldwin County. Here, the landscape changes, offering a dense canopy of pine and scrub oak that provides a deceptive sense of privacy. It was within this quiet, rural pocket that the search intensified, guided by digital footprints and the mechanical breadcrumbs left behind by those who believe the earth can keep a secret forever. The air in early February carries a particular weight in Alabama. It is damp and clinging, a cold that doesn't just sit on the skin, but seems to soak into the very red clay of the earth. Detectives worked alongside FBI agents, sifting through the mundane details of a life interrupted. They looked for the missing mattress, a large and heavy object that does not simply vanish without effort. They looked for the bedding that had been stripped in haste. As they scoured the secondary location, the silence of the woods was eventually broken by the discovery of disturbed earth. Beneath the surface, wrapped in layers of plastic and the very bedding that had once provided comfort in a family home, the search came to a devastating resolution. The recovery was a slow, methodical process, a stark contrast to the violence that had necessitated it. Forensic teams worked with a quiet reverence, uncovering not just remains, but the small, personal artifacts that bridged the gap between a case file and a human life. Among the folds of the burial wrappings, investigators found pieces of jewelry. These were not mere trinkets. They were intimate memorials. Some of the items featured small, clear photographs, charms that held the likenesses of Aurelia and little Anthony. Seeing those faces, frozen in moments of past happiness while standing in the center of a crime scene, anchored the tragedy in a way that no police report could fully capture. The physical evidence told a story of a struggle that was both brief and overwhelming. The criminal complaint would later detail the use of an edged weapon, a clinical term for a reality that was far more visceral. Aurelia had fought, evidenced by the wounds to her chest and back, likely attempting to shield her children until the very end. 17-year-old Niurka, a young woman on the cusp of her own adult life, was silenced alongside her mother. But perhaps most difficult for the seasoned investigators was the evidence regarding 2-year-old Anthony. The trauma he sustained to his head spoke of a cruelty that lacked any shred of mercy, a finality that the quiet woods of Summerdale had held in confidence for nearly 2 months. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the excavation site, the focus shifted from the where to the who. Juan Carlos Argueta Guerra, known to some by the alias Hector, was already in the system, a man whose presence in the victims' lives had transitioned from an acquaintance to a specter. He had been held on kidnapping charges since early February, but with the discovery in the Baldwin County dirt, the legal machinery began to turn with a new, heavier purpose. The charges were no longer about a disappearance. They were about a permanent theft of life. The investigation into Guerra revealed a web of domestic complexity. While he sat in a cell, authorities continued to probe the involvement of others, including Silverio Garcia. Garcia's connection to the household was layered. He was Aurelia's employer, but he was also intimately involved with her elder 21-year-old daughter. At the time of the murders, he was living within that same family structure. While Garcia faced immediate charges related to the illegal possession of a firearm and was held on a federal detainer, his shadow loomed large over the narrative of the home's collapse. The investigators moved forward with a grim determination, knowing that every piece of plastic, every fiber of the recovered bedding, and every photograph on those discarded charms was a witness that would eventually have its day in court. For now, the 3 souls were no longer lost to the woods. They were beginning the long, somber journey back to the light of justice, leaving the cold silence of the Alabama winter behind them. The investigation shifted from the cold, damp earth of Baldwin County back to the quiet neighborhood where the silence first began. In the wake of such a discovery, the details of the domestic space take on a heavy, haunting significance. When the authorities first crossed the threshold of the residence on January the 31, the air inside was still, holding the faint, lingering sense of a lived-in home. Perhaps the ghost of a home-cooked meal or the soft fragrance of a child's laundry. But beneath these mundane anchors lay a jagged reality. The absence of a single mattress became a focal point of the initial sweep, a missing piece of a domestic puzzle that suggested a hurried, violent alteration of the environment. The struggle had not been silent, even if the neighbors hadn't heard it at the time. Evidence of a confrontation was etched into the very walls and floors. Investigators noted the placement of furniture and the stark, chilling presence of blood that had soaked into the surfaces where the mattress should have been. This was not a disappearance characterized by a walk into the woods. It was a removal from the sanctuary of the home. The mundane items left behind, a stray toy, a kitchen utensil, a pair of shoes, stood in silent testimony to lives interrupted mid-sentence. Silverio Garcia, a man of 60 years who had been Aurelia's employer, quickly became a figure of intense interest. His connection to the family was deeply entwined, as he had been in a relationship with Aurelia's 21-year-old daughter and shared the same roof. The complexities of these household dynamics often hide in the shadows of daily routine until a light is shone upon them by tragedy. Garcia was soon held on a detainer by Homeland Security, a consequence of his undocumented status, and faced charges related to the possession of a firearm. While the legal machinery began to turn around him, the focus intensified on the man known to some as Hector, but identified by the state as Juan Carlos Argueta Guerra. Guerra's presence in the narrative is one of calculated deception. When first approached, he provided authorities with false identification, an act of obstruction that would later be added to a growing list of capital charges. The investigation revealed a path that led from the blood-stained floor of the Mobile County residence to the shallow, plastic-wrapped graves in Summerdale. It was a journey marked by the use of an edged weapon, a detail that the district attorney would later describe with a heavy gravity. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Not just the forensic markers of the struggle, but the personal effects that were never meant to be found in the dirt. Among the debris and the bedding used to shroud the victims, investigators recovered pieces of jewelry. These were not mere ornaments. They were intimate relics of a mother's love. Charms bearing the photographs and names of Aurelia and her 2-year-old son, Anthony, were found cast aside with the remains. These images, intended to be worn close to the heart, were instead recovered from a place of cold concealment. It is these small, tangible connections to the living that often provide the most profound sense of loss during a forensic recovery. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on the day the charges were upgraded, the legal weight of the case became clear. The district attorney's office announced they would be seeking the ultimate penalty. The charges were a grim inventory of the final moments: kidnapping, burglary, the murder of a child under the age of 14, and the abuse of a corpse. The transition from a missing persons case to a capital murder trial was complete, leaving the community to grapple with the reality that the 3 souls they had searched for were finally found, though not in the way anyone had prayed for. The silence of the Alabama winter was no longer one of mystery, but one of mourning and the slow, deliberate pursuit of a resolution that could never truly restore what was lost. As the rain begins its steady rhythm against the glass, I want you to let go of the day's weight. We are here only to remember and to finally bring a wandering story home to rest. The evening air across the Mobile River is shifting now, cooling as the March humidity of the Gulf softens into a gentle, silver mist that clings to the pine needles and the moss-draped oaks. It is a time for the world to grow quiet, for the frantic pace of the day to dissolve into the steady, unhurried pulse of the night. You are safe here, nestled in the stillness of your own space, where the only requirement is to listen and to breathe. My voice will remain a constant, a steady container for these events, ensuring that as we look back at the lives of Aurelia, Niurka, and little Anthony, we do so with a profound sense of peace in the present moment. They were more than a collection of headlines or a series of coordinates on a map. They were a family that shared meals, dreams, and the simple, quiet rituals of a home in Alabama. In the stillness of this late March evening, we acknowledge their journey not with the jarring urgency of a newsflash, but with the steady, respectful observation of those who believe that every life deserves to be remembered with dignity. The weight of the world is falling away now, leaving only the sound of my voice to guide you through the details of a story that has finally found its way home. The mist that settles over Mobile County tonight carries a certain weight, a heavy, cooling blanket that invites the mind to drift into a state of quiet reflection. It is a time to acknowledge the beauty of a life well lived, even when the ending is marked by a deep, resonant silence. The rain continues its rhythmic, steady patter, a natural metronome that keeps time with the slow, even pace of your breath. We are here to bring a sense of closure to a wandering story, to offer a safe harbor for the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves. The air is softening, the shadows are lengthening, and as the day's burdens dissolve, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a narrative that is both tragic and profoundly human. According to those who knew them, the rituals of their daily life were simple and grounded in the warmth of their shared home. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of laughter in the afternoon, and the quiet, steady rhythm of the night were the threads that wove the fabric of their existence. As we move forward into the heart of this account, we do so with a gentle, unhurried focus, ensuring that every detail is handled with the care and the reverence it deserves. The stillness of the night is our companion, a silent witness to the telling of a story that has finally reached its destination. We are here to remember, to reflect, and to ensure that the memory of Aurelia, Niurka, and little Anthony is held in a container of safety and profound, lasting peace. The physical space of the Mobile County residence in late January held the lingering chill of the Gulf breeze, a damp cold that clings to the siding of a home and hushes the neighborhood. It was a modest structure, the kind of place where the daily rhythms of life, the scraping of chairs, the murmur of the television, the high-pitched laughter of a 2-year-old, usually formed a constant, comforting static. But by the final days of the month, that static had faded into an unnatural, heavy stillness. The air inside the house had become stagnant, no longer stirred by the opening of doors or the hurried footsteps of a family preparing for the day. In the kitchen, the mundane details of a life interrupted remained in suspended animation. A half-empty glass of water sat on a counter, its surface undisturbed, while the digital clock on the microwave blinked its rhythmic amber pulse into a room that no longer required the measurement of time. There is a specific kind of gravity to a house that has been suddenly vacated. It is not the clean, intentional emptiness of a home for sale, but rather a space where the soul has been abruptly withdrawn, leaving behind the small, intimate artifacts of existence. A coat draped over the back of a chair, a pair of small shoes tucked near the entryway. These things began to lose their context as the days stretched into a week. In the quiet corners of a home, silence speaks the loudest. Not a sudden silence, but one that settles like dust over the things left behind. It is a slow accumulation of absence that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. By January 31st, The transition from a quiet house to a concerning one had completed its cycle in the mind of a watchful neighbor. It began as a small, quiet realization, the kind that registers in the periphery of one's daily routine. Perhaps it was the sight of mail beginning to crowd the small box, or the realization that the porch light had remained extinguished for too many nights in a row. There was no grand sign of distress, no broken windows or shouting in the street, only the unsettling lack of the familiar. The neighbor looked toward the residence and felt the weight of that stillness. It was the realization that the hum of a family's life had been replaced by a void, a gap in the fabric of the neighborhood that felt increasingly permanent. This observation, born of a simple concern for one's fellow man, would be the first thread pulled in a tapestry of events that would eventually lead the world to the doorstep of this silent house. The observation was a somber one, marking the moment when a private tragedy began its slow, inevitable journey into the light of public record. For several days, the house had stood on the edge of January, holding its secrets behind locked doors, until the silence finally became too loud to keep. The morning of the investigation began with a deceptive stillness, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. As the first responders crossed the threshold of the residence on that final day of January, the air inside held a preserved chill, carrying the faint, metallic scent of iron and the lingering aroma of spices from a kitchen that had suddenly ceased its function. This was no longer a home defined by the rhythmic sounds of a 2-year-old's footsteps or the quiet conversations of a mother and daughter. It had become a meticulously preserved site of interest, where every displaced object told a story of a life interrupted. The lead investigators moved through the rooms with a practiced, somber deliberation, their flashlights cutting through the dimness to reveal the unsettling geometry of the scene. In the master bedroom, the absence was more than just the people who should have been there. It was the physical void where a mattress had once rested, leaving behind a stark, empty frame that felt like an open wound in the center of the house. Upon closer inspection, the floorboards beneath where that mattress had been revealed a harrowing narrative written in dark, dried stains, signs of a struggle that the occupants had clearly lost. As the deep dive into the evidence continued throughout that long morning, forensic teams began to document the mundane anchors of the victims' lives that remained untouched. A small, colorful toy sat near the baseboard, a silent reminder of Anthony's presence, while a stack of mail remained on a side table, its dates marking the exact moment the world stopped for Aurelia and Niurka. The contrast between these symbols of domestic peace and the edged weapon trauma later described in the criminal complaints created a profound, heavy atmosphere of tragedy. Information began to drift in from the perimeter of the scene as neighbors spoke of a white truck and a man known to some as Hector, but legally identified as Juan Carlos Argueta Guerra. The investigation soon shifted its focus toward a missing mattress and the jewelry that Aurelia was known to cherish, pendants and charms that bore the faces of her children. While the house remained at the edge of the woods, the search was beginning to expand into the cold, damp earth of the surrounding counties, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs and witness statements that would eventually lead to a shallow, plastic-lined grave in Summerdale. For now, the investigators stood in the fading light of the afternoon, surrounded by the shadows of a family that had vanished into the winter mist. The transition from a missing persons case to a potential homicide often begins with a single quiet realization inside a home that looks almost normal. On the afternoon of January 31st, when officers first crossed the threshold of the residence in Mobile County, the air inside was still, holding the faint, lingering scent of a life interrupted. There were no shattered windows or kicked-in doors to greet them. Instead, the house offered a heavy, expectant silence. As we follow the investigators through the entryway, we see the small details of a Tuesday that never finished. A jacket draped over a chair, perhaps intended for the 2-year-old Anthony. A half-empty cup sitting on a counter. The mundane anchors of a domestic existence that suggest the occupants expected to return within minutes. However, as the walkthrough progressed into the private quarters of the home, the clinical curiosity of the responding officers began to sharpen into something more pointed and somber. It wasn't the presence of chaos that caught their attention, but rather a specific, jarring absence of order. In the bedrooms, the typical clutter of a family with 3 children had been disturbed in a way that felt deliberate. They noted the small things first: a discarded shoe, a drawer left pulled out just an inch too far. But then they entered the room that changed the trajectory of the entire afternoon. In the center of the space, the bed frame stood like a skeletal remains of a comfort now gone. The mattress was missing. It was a large, heavy void in the room, a rectangular vacancy that felt louder than any scream. Investigators looked for what was there, but it was what was missing: a simple mattress that told the first chapter of a much longer mystery. To remove a mattress requires strength, time, and a desperate necessity to hide what it might have absorbed. The investigators noticed the floor beneath where the mattress should have been. There were traces left behind, dark stains that had seeped through the fabric and onto the wood, confirming their burgeoning fears. The absence of that heavy object suggested a dark choreography. Someone had gone to great lengths to strip the room of its most prominent feature, likely because it held the indelible signature of a struggle that Aurelia and her children could not win. The officers moved carefully now, their flashlights cutting through the dim corners of the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They weren't just looking for people anymore. They were looking for the story of a disappearance that had clearly turned violent. The missing mattress wasn't just furniture. It was a piece of evidence that had been spirited away into the night, much like the family themselves. As the sun began to dip below the Alabama horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the floorboards of the empty room, the realization settled in that the quiet house was no longer a home, but a meticulously altered scene of a crime that was only just beginning to reveal its true, horrific scale. The investigation would soon pivot from the walls of this house to the digital and physical trails left by those who had last been seen in its company. But for now, the focus remained on that empty bed frame, a haunting symbol of a rest that had been permanently, cruelly broken. To understand the magnitude of the silence now inhabiting that home, One must look past the yellow police tape and into the vibrant, hard-working lives of those who once gave these rooms their breath. Aurelia Choc Cac was a woman whose 40 years of life had been defined by a relentless, quiet resilience, the kind of strength often found in those who have crossed borders and built worlds from very little. She was more than just a name on a missing persons report or a statistic in a criminal complaint. She was the steady heartbeat of her household. Neighbors saw her not as a figure of tragedy, but as a provider, a woman who balanced the heavy demands of labor with the delicate requirements of motherhood. Her hands, later described in grim detail by forensic reports, were hands that had spent a lifetime preparing meals, smoothing down hair, and reaching out to guide her children through the complexities of a new life in Alabama. A mother's life is written in the care she gives, and Aurelia's world was centered on the two children who walked beside her into the Alabama dusk. She carried the weight of their future on her shoulders, moving through the world with a purpose that was entirely selfless, making her sudden absence feel not just like a disappearance, but like the collapse of a foundation. Beside her stood Niurka Choc, a 17-year-old girl perched precariously and beautifully on the threshold of adulthood. At 17, the world is supposed to be a map of expanding horizons, a series of firsts and soon-to-bes that Niurka was just beginning to navigate. She was a teenager in Alabama with the same digital footprints and whispered dreams as any other girl her age, likely thinking of graduations, friendships, and the independent life that waited just a year away. There is a specific kind of cruelty in a life taken at 17, as it halts a story right as the protagonist is finding her own voice. Niurka wasn't just a daughter. She was Aurelia's companion, a young woman who was becoming a pillar of support for her mother and a protector for her tiny brother. Her presence in the house was the bridge between the traditional world of her mother and the modern, fast-paced reality of an American teenager. Then there was Anthony. At just 2 years old, Anthony Garcia Choc was in the golden age of discovery, a time when every corner of a room holds a mystery and every shadow is a playground. His life was measured in small, soft footprints and the high-pitched laughter that should have continued to echo against the walls of their residence. But the air in that house had grown heavy with a different kind of presence. As investigators began to peel back the layers of the family's daily life, their attention turned toward the figures who occupied the periphery of Aurelia's world, those who held the keys to her schedule, and perhaps, they hoped, the secrets of her disappearance. Among these figures was a man named Silverio Garcia, a 60-year-old who represented a complex intersection of employment and intimacy within the family's inner circle. Garcia was not merely a distant boss providing a paycheck. He was the man Aurelia saw nearly every day for work, and his ties to the household ran significantly deeper than a standard professional arrangement. In the quiet, interconnected communities of Mobile County, the lines between family and work often blur, and in this case, the blur was pronounced. Garcia was living with Aurelia's 21-year-old daughter, an older sibling to the missing children, creating a domestic web that placed him at the very heart of their social fabric. When the authorities first approached Garcia, the atmosphere was one of calculated observation, The investigation into a missing mother and her toddlers is a delicate clockwork of procedure, where every interview is a search for a gear that doesn't quite turn. Garcia's position as a provider and a partner to the eldest daughter made him a natural focal point for the sheriff's deputies and the FBI agents who were now descending on the area. However, as they began to look into his background, they found more than just a concerned employer. There were legal irregularities that immediately complicated his status. Garcia was found to be in possession of a firearm, a pistol that he was legally forbidden from owning. This initial weapons charge provided the leverage the law often requires to hold a person of interest, while the more harrowing elements of a case are pieced together. Simultaneously, a hold was placed on him by Homeland Security investigations due to his undocumented status, ensuring that while the search for Aurelia, Niurka, and little Anthony continued, one of the primary figures in their lives would remain exactly where the police could find him. The interrogation rooms at the station are often cold, bright places where the passage of time is marked only by the shifting of weight in a chair or the scratch of a pen against a notepad. Investigators sat across from Garcia, looking for the flicker of a lie or the tremor of a guilty conscience. They knew that in cases like this, the person closest to the home is often the one holding the lantern that leads to the truth. Yet, as the hours turned into days, the narrative began to shift. There is a specific kind of patience required in a capital murder investigation, a trust in the process that allows the evidence to speak louder than the initial suspicions. While Garcia remained in custody, tangled in the web of federal holds and weapons violations, the forensic trail was beginning to wind in a different direction. We must understand that the law moves like a slow river, winding through the lives of those who knew the family, looking for the one stone that doesn't fit the shore. For a time, it seemed that Silverio Garcia might be that stone, the catalyst for the tragedy that had befallen the Choc family. He was a man with secrets, certainly, the hidden gun, the precarious legal standing. But the authorities were beginning to realize that having secrets is not always the same as having blood on one's hands. The procedural dance continued, with the HSI hold keeping him immobilized, serving as a placeholder in the justice system, while the real architect of this nightmare remained in the shadows. It is a sobering reflection on how the search for truth often involves following paths that eventually turn into dead ends, or at least paths that lead to smaller transgressions, while the greater evil remains momentarily out of sight. The community watched, the eldest daughter waited, and the investigators kept their eyes on the horizon, knowing that every detail filed and every statement taken was bringing them closer to the moment the earth would finally yield its grim cargo. Garcia was a piece of the puzzle, but as the frost began to melt from the Alabama soil, it became clear he was not the piece that should solve the mystery of the missing mattress and the crimson stains left behind. While the legal system moved its heavy gears around Silverio Garcia, a different shadow began to lengthen across the investigation, one that felt more direct, more visceral, and ultimately more devastating. This shadow belonged to a 31-year-old man whose presence in the community had been quiet, almost invisible, until the weight of the evidence began to pull him into the light. Behind every mystery is a name, and for the Mobile County Sheriff's Office, That name began to echo in the quiet halls of the station. Juan Carlos. But even that name was a layer of a deeper mask, as those who knew him in the flickering streetlights and the humid Alabama nights knew him only as Hector. The transition from a missing persons case to a hunt for a predator crystallized on February 9th. On that day, the air was still holding the damp chill of late winter, the kind of cold that seems to seep into the brickwork of the county jail. Juan Carlos Argueta Guerra was taken into custody, though at that specific moment, the full horror of the edged weapon and the plastic-wrapped bundles in Baldwin County remained hidden beneath the earth. The initial arrest was a placeholder, a legal tether to keep a dangerous man from drifting back into the shadows. He was charged with kidnapping, a word that offered a sliver of hope to the public. A word that suggested Aurelia and her children might still be held somewhere, breathing, waiting for a rescue that the universe had already denied them. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was one of clinical observation. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low electric frequency, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the metal table where Hector sat. Detectives watched the way he moved, the way he breathed, looking for the tiny fractures in a persona built on aliases and evasion. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a cell, a heavy, sterile quiet that smells of industrial cleaner and stale air. For weeks, this was the world of Juan Carlos. He sat within those four walls while, outside, the FBI and local deputies were painstakingly tracing his movements, connecting the dots between a missing mattress and a man who thought he could simply rename himself and walk away from the crimson stains of January 31st. The investigators didn't just see a suspect. They saw a man who had navigated the world through deception, using the name Hector to bridge the gaps in his history. Each day he spent in custody was a day the truth climbed closer to the surface. The arrest on February 9th was the first crack in the dam. The moment the investigation shifted from asking, "Where are they?" to "What did you do?" Even as he maintained his silence, the evidence was beginning to speak for him, whispering of a struggle in a bedroom and a journey toward the quiet woods of Summerdale. The shadow of Juan Carlos was no longer a ghost. It was a prisoner, waiting for the spring thaw to reveal what the winter had tried to bury. The month of February in southern Alabama is rarely a season of deep snow, but it possesses a biting, damp chill that seems to settle into the very marrow of those tasked with scouring the earth. As the calendar pages turned, the initial frantic energy of the search began to settle into a heavy, rhythmic endurance. The Mobile County Sheriff's deputies, now bolstered by the specialized analytical resources of the FBI, found themselves trapped in a period of environmental suspension. The transition from the dead of winter toward the first tentative reaches of spring brought a change in the landscape that was both a blessing and a burden for the investigators. In the thickets of Baldwin County, the dense underbrush began to shift, the skeletal gray of dormant hardwoods slowly giving way to a haze of pale green. Retracing steps became the daily liturgy of the investigation. Teams moved through the rural stretches of Summerdale, their boots sinking into the red clay that characterizes this corner of the South. They weren't just looking for the family anymore. They were looking for a disturbance in the natural order, a patch of earth that didn't quite match its surroundings, or a depression in the pine needles that suggested something had been laid to rest beneath the canopy. The collaboration between local authorities and federal agents was seamless but quiet, a shared recognition that the trail was growing colder with every sunrise. They pored over cell tower pings and GPS data, trying to map the movements of a vehicle that had vanished into the humid night weeks prior. There is a specific taxing psychology that accompanies a cold trail. It is a form of patient melancholy that weighs on the heart of a community. In the neighborhood where Aurelia and her children had lived, the silence of the empty house became a physical presence. Neighbors would look toward the windows, perhaps expecting to see the flicker of a television or the small, moving silhouette of 2-year-old Anthony, only to be met by the stolid reflection of the street. For the investigators, the silence was a challenge. They worked in the space between what they knew and what they could prove, navigating the mounting absence of the 3 victims. The searchers noticed the small shifts in the world around them, the way the morning fog lingered longer in the low-lying fields, and how the birds began to return to the Alabama pines. It felt like a betrayal of sorts. The world was preparing for a renewal of life while 3 souls remained unaccounted for. Time does not stop for the missing. The trees in Alabama began to bud, unaware of the secret buried beneath the soil of Summerdale. Every afternoon, as the light began to fail and the search teams packed away their equipment, there was a collective breath held, a hope that tomorrow the earth would finally yield what it had been holding captive. The long wait was not just about the passage of days, but about the slow, agonizing realization that the answers were likely closer and much darker than anyone had dared to voice. The search for Aurelia, Niurka, and little Anthony did not conclude with the dramatic flair of a television broadcast, but rather with the heavy, rhythmic thud of shovels against the damp earth of Baldwin County. It was March 13th, a day where the transition from winter to spring usually brings a sense of renewal. Yet in a secluded, quiet spot in Summerdale, the air felt unmoving and ancient. The investigators had been led to a patch of ground that looked indistinguishable from the surrounding brush to the untrained eye. There were no markers here, no headstones, only the indifferent sprawl of Alabama pine and the low hum of distant traffic that seemed to underscore the profound isolation of the site. As the topsoil was carefully peeled back, the silence of the woods became absolute, as if the birds and the wind were paying a subconscious tribute to the 3 lives that had been silenced weeks prior. There is a certain clinical drift that occurs during a forensic recovery, a necessary detachment that allows the human mind to process the unthinkable. The investigators worked with a methodical, slow-motion grace, clearing away the red clay to reveal the mundane materials of a household, bedding and heavy sheets of plastic. These were not the implements of a burial, but the tools of concealment, meant to shield a dark deed from the eyes of the world. There were no screams in this moment, no frantic calls for help. There was only the heavy reality of the earth giving up its secrets. The plastic, crinkled and stained by the elements, held a weight that far exceeded its physical properties. It represented the final, desperate attempt to erase a mother and her children from the fabric of existence, a task that the soil had finally refused to complete. As the recovery progressed, the monotone cadence of the reporting officers reflected the sobering realization of how these lives had been ended. It was not a sudden accident or a disappearance into the unknown, but a deliberate act carried out with an edged weapon. The clinical language of the coroner's report would later detail the sharp force trauma, the wounds to Aurelia's chest and back, and the devastating injuries to 2-year-old Anthony's head. To hear these details delivered in a flat, professional tone is to understand the true nature of tragedy. It is often quiet, documented in ink on white paper, and devoid of the chaos we imagine. The edged weapon had left marks that no amount of time or earth could truly hide. Under the cover of plastic and the weight of the earth, the search finally ended, not with a shout, but with the quiet click of a camera and the bowing of heads. The flash of the forensic photographer illuminated the scene in brief, stark bursts, capturing the position of the remains and the discarded bedding that had served as a temporary shroud. In those flashes, the magnitude of the loss became undeniable. The investigators, seasoned by years of witnessing the aftermath of violence, stood in a loose circle, their boots caked in the same mud that had held the Choc family for 2 long months. There was a somber resolution in the air, the kind of peace that comes not from joy, but from the closing of a terrible open door. The uncertainty of February had been replaced by the cold, hard facts of March. And as the stretchers were loaded into the back of the waiting vans, the woods of Summerdale returned to their natural stillness, though the ground there would never feel the same again. Within the disturbed earth of the Summerdale site, among the heavy layers of plastic and the weight of the Alabama soil, the investigators discovered something that stopped the clinical rhythm of the recovery process. It was a small collection of jewelry, tangled and caked with the dark dampness of the ground, yet possessing a resilience that the elements could not touch. These were not merely ornaments or items of value in a material sense. They were the most intimate anchors of identity found at the scene. Among the pieces were pendants that bore the unmistakable faces of Aurelia and little 2-year-old Anthony, their smiles captured in a moment of safety long before the shadows of January had closed in around them. There is a profound, almost silent power in a physical object that survives when the voice has been stilled. To the investigators, these items were the definitive evidence needed to bridge the gap between a missing persons report and the reality of the tragedy. But to the memory of the family, they were a reclamation of personhood. In the sterile environment of a forensic search, a small piece of metal can return a name to a soul, transforming an unidentified remain back into a mother and a son. The luster of the gold and silver against the dark, unforgiving soil provided a sharp, heartbreaking contrast, a mundane anchor of a life once lived with care and affection. As the sun caught the surface of the jewelry, it served as a reminder of the daily rituals that had once defined their lives. The act of putting on a necklace in the morning, or the choice of a pendant that kept a loved one close to the heart. A photograph on a pendant remains bright even in the dark, a small beacon of identity that refused to be forgotten by the world. These items had traveled from the warmth of a home into the cold silence of the woods, enduring the passage of 2 months as silent witnesses. They carried the weight of names that had been whispered in prayers and shouted in search parties, finally surfacing to tell the truth. The investigation moved forward with this new, somber clarity, as the jewelry was carefully documented and placed into evidence bags. The physical presence of the names, Aurelia and Anthony, etched or encased in the metal, acted as a protective barrier against the anonymity of death. It was as if the family had reached out through time and earth to ensure they were recognized, ensuring that the story ending here was not one of disappearance, but of a return to the light of acknowledgement. According to the reports, the preservation of these images was remarkable, serving as a final, defiant act of visibility in a place meant for concealment.